Okay, so I know we're talking about uncertainty today, and everyone has some level of uncertainty, but what does that really mean? So the best way to look at uncertainty is really kind of in a spectrum approach, right? So not everyone has the same kind of uncertainty pains. So if you look at it from a spectrum approach, what you really have is on the left side is, full certainty, right? You have actuals, right? That you know what they are. But as you move further and further out, what happens? Well, you don't just go from certainty to complete uncertainty, right? Things start to feel a bit cloudy, becomes a bit more difficult to see, right? Your outcomes can be a little higher or a little lower than you expected, but generally that's kind of fog, is how I would classify that. But you get to a point, and I think Larissa showed it with the cone of uncertainty, is you get to a point where probability and distribution becomes really difficult, right? It actually becomes almost like a black hole, right? Things start to feel very dark, very murky. The tools and techniques that you used when you had a little bit of certainty really start to fade away, right? Some people hold on to them too long, and that's a mistake, quite frankly. But you kind of end up in a different world where, again, things are black holes, right? So we're going to kind of work on that metaphor of operating in the dark and kind of black holes here. So let's look at some of the tools that we can use in these environments. So under a kind of somewhat hazy, cloudy environment, things like corridor planning, I think you'll hear about this later in the presentation. So that's sort of dynamic planning with like different ranges, so like a high, mid, low type approach. Again, probability is one of your best friends when you have a little bit of murkiness. And you can use things like Monte Carlo simulation, which can be great for doing like confidence intervals, 95% confidence interval at risk and so forth. And really what's going down the pipeline is really more machine learning, AI algorithms that can help do that as well. Of course, it relies on having good data and access to data, which as you get into the murky areas, that's where the data becomes much less available. So when you move into that kind of really dark area, you're looking at things like, what can you do? So you look at trying to influence, right? If you can't predict, then try to influence, right? So that's the best thing to do. Be a bit more prescriptive. You have to also think about continuous screening. So always looking for opportunities and threats, looking left and right. And we'll talk about that in a second. But we're also going to introduce, and something that's I'm very passionate about, is the life cycle analysis. We're going to spend a lot of time about that. So that's kind of this flashlight in the dark I'm going to present. It's also this sort of path to walk down in uncertainty. And then the last one, which I think actually finance isn't particularly good at, if you ask me, and that's running kind of real experiments. So we're going to talk about scenario analysis, right? You're not really running that experiment, but real experiments where you really actually invest money into things and you see if it fails. And if it fails, hopefully it fails fast. Otherwise, hopefully it takes off. So that portfolio analysis, being more of a finance term, has to incorporate experiments as well. So Larissa, if we can jump to the next slide here. So I think we've painted kind of the definition of certainty. What I want to do now is just spend a couple minutes or a minute or two here on kind of the common mistakes we see with uncertainty. And I want to just point out that good scenario planning, because we are talking about scenario planning today, really starts at the beginning, right? Which is your strategic plan or your target setting exercise. So let's look at the visual on the right. We call this kind of a failure to launch scenario here. So if we look at it, I'll define that as kind of astronomical expectations with incremental outcomes, right? So everything's a hockey stick, right? And the reason why, and I'll cut to the point here at the bottom. The reason why is we spend so much time fighting over next year's resources. And then we try to show what we can do with next year's resources. And that's really a bad approach. We need to take more of a holistic life cycle view in our strategy. So we incorporate how we started, how we kind of matriculated through the life cycle, which I'll talk about in a second, and then ultimately when we need to jump to new ideas. That's going to bust up or avoid this kind of failure to launch strategy. So I'll just hit you with a couple of things to think about. I'd ask you to think about, is your current planning process, especially your strategic planning process, is that sort of a fixed duration, right? Is that 3 to 5 years? Again, are you typically showing sort of hockey stick growth from that? Do you always kind of feel like you're in year one of your strategic plan? And most importantly, when you're done with your strategic plan, who really buys into it? Does it just kind of get shelved? If you answer yes to any of those, then I think you potentially have this failure to launch scenario here. So I would think about that heavily. Larissa, if we can go to the next slide here. Thank you very much. So now let's bring back in that kind of uncertainty element where we're kind of in the dark, and how do we navigate that? Well, the best way to navigate that is really two ways. You can think about yourself as a child, maybe walking at night in the dark. The two best things you have to know where you're getting to is stay on the path and use the flashlight or the torch, right? You want to be able to go left and right and make sure you're staying on that path. So that's the analogy we're talking about here today. So what does the life cycle do? Well, you can see with the life cycle, we can expand just that typical 3 to 5 year view, looking at the whole life cycle of your strategy. And what that does is it really makes sure that what you're doing is you're investing in the real problem, right? You're investing in the bottlenecks, you're finding the unlocks, and you're solving them. And you can prove that through analysis that you did that, right? That's critical. So you've solved the real problem. As you start to move up the curve, you're looking at things like, are we keeping the competition out? How are we doing against the competition? What kind of different strategies do we have to fight competition as we're gaining market share and growing and creating shareholder value? Are we maximizing when we get to the top of the plateau? Are we maximizing cash flow? That's really where cash is going to be king up there. You need to maximize that as long as possible. So you're really realizing your strategy. And then the reason why we look at the outside of it, or the backside of it, is because we need to know when to shift to new strategies, right? A lot of people say, well, that's just too murky. That's just too far out there. You have to have that view, and you have to be able to figure out how you're going to matriculate through that. And then obviously with that, once you know your path, the yellow brick road, or whatever analogy you want to use, it's looking at scenarios. So it's that flashlight. So kind of going back and forth, making sure you're on the path, making sure you're looking for new paths, new curves to create if necessary. So you're constantly screening. It's a full 365 day a year process. Unfortunately, I mean, you're constantly looking to make sure that you're optimizing. And then the other one, just to point out there, is cash is king, right? Everything else is what I would call a local efficiency. So if you're really focused on revenue growth or operating margin or market share, just keep in mind that you can build one of those and boost that metric up, that KPI, but it might come at a cost somewhere else down the life cycle, or sorry, down the curve. So it's really about producing the free cash flow, and that's what you need to be focused on there. So let's just go to the last slide here, Larissa, please. Great. And so now really what we want to do here is want to do a call to action. Okay, so we've kind of talked about the methodology. I know we went pretty fast through that, but now it's sort of a call to action for you to think about. So if this is the J curve, if this is the life cycle, how many different strategic business units or strategies or plans do you really have operating? So you don't just have one. If you're a big enough company, chances are you've got a portfolio of different strategies. Where are they on this life cycle? So that's very important. Can you even go back and identify where that strategy started? Can you go back to inception when you were making investment and you were breaking a bottleneck and creating an opportunity for your company to move into, and then hopefully keep out the competition? Are you able to go back and do that? And if you kind of take this life cycle view, how does that really impact your planning going forward? Are you going to expect to get a 10% growth rate if you are in plateau, or if you're in decline? Chances are you're not. But then again, if you're in growth stage, 10% might not be that good. So how does this really shape the different parts of your business? And then ultimately, what is that portfolio mix that makes sense? So you can be a company that's largely sitting at plateau, but reality is the market's going to really benefit companies that have a good mix, right? So if you have a good mix of products or strategies that are in more of a growth stage, you're going to get rewarded for that. So it's having that right mix. And what I said before is even doing some experiments, right? So some of your experiments might be the things that are in that initial investment stage. You're actually investing money, not just running scenarios on that. It's critical to have that mix. And then I guess I'll just leave you with this last thought here is, so what does the next 5 years look like if you have this kind of mindset? Will you have that failure to launch scenario or view where you're always predicting, these huge hockey sticks, but in reality, it's just very incremental growth? I think this is a great way to rethink your business and how that path needs to look. And then obviously on top of that, it's about running the scenarios to make sure that you're staying on the path. If you're looking for new paths to create, I think you'll find a lot of success in uncertainty. And I'll just leave this with last thought is this approach, although we all probably understand this and we've seen this before and to some degree, largely FP&A doesn't follow this that much, right? FP&A will go to their traditional approaches, but if you look at something like a VC or a startup, these companies get this, and this is what they're using to pitch for funding and so forth. And so I think as FP&A, we need to kind of get back to this and think about that whole life cycle approach.